based on tactics that resolves critical incidents with the least amount of force.
Now, how many years were you an officer how many years were you an officer for the APD SWAT team?
Approximately 7.5 from 98 to about 2006 or a little after.
And generally, what types of calls became SWAT call-outs?
Would be suicidal individuals armed, hostage rescue calls, search warrants, arrest warrants with exigent circumstances, sniper situations, active shooter situations, dignitary protection details, any kind of situation where the field might need a little extra help or does not have the tools or skills to handle the situation.
How much experience have you had dealing with individuals who are armed and who may possibly be suicidal or suffer from mental illness?
Quite extensive experience.
So when you say quite extensive, what do you mean?
Basically my whole career from 93 till present time. And then when I was assigned to Special Weapons and Tactics, that was a lot of the calls that we would go to.
Now, I understand you were promoted to a field sergeant, is that right?
That's correct, sir.
When did you become a field sergeant?
About middle of 2006. I'm sorry, I guess it'd be about the end of 2006.
And what role does a sergeant serve in the Albuquerque Police Department?
The role of a sergeant is to instruct and advise the subordinates and their performance, their work performance.
And what, I'm sorry?
And to be accountable for that performance of your subordinates.
Okay. Now, what is your current assignment?
My current assignment right now is Special Weapons and Tactics.
So you went from becoming a field sergeant to becoming the sergeant of Special Weapons and Tactics.
That is correct, sir.
When did that transfer occur?
Around 2010.
Now, how does your role as a SWAT team sergeant differ from your role as a SWAT team officer?
As a SWAT team officer, I was basically just responsible for myself and my performance. I would keep my teammates accountable for their performance. But as a sergeant now, I'm accountable for 20 individuals, and on a SWAT activation over 20 individuals, and I have to be accountable for their performance.
Now, how many years have you served as a SWAT team sergeant?
About 4.5 to 5.
Okay. Now I'd like to turn your attention to Officer Pettis. How did you first meet Officer Pettis?
Around 2006, 2007, I met him briefly at Foothills Area Command, which I was assigned to as a sergeant. Being promoted, it was graveyard.
Okay. When did Officer Pettis first join the Albuquerque Police Department SWAT team?
I believe it was around 2009.
At the time of the Boyd incident, how long had Officer Pettis worked for you?
Around 4 years.
Have you seen Officer Pettis' work and training?
I have.
How many training days do you believe you have spent with Officer Pettis?
In 4 years, quite a few. We train minimum 1 day a week, every day or every Wednesday of the year, and sometimes we train additional hours. We have additional schools we go to, so quite extensive. I've seen him and been training with him.
So using my rough lawyer math, again, qualifying it as lawyer math, you've spent at least 200 training days with Officer Pettis. Is that a fair statement?
That's fair.
Have you observed Officer Pettis' work during SWAT activations?
I have.
How many SWAT activations have you supervised Officer Pettis during his work as a SWAT team officer?
We get about roughly between 80 and 100 call-outs a year. So Officer Pettis, he's been to most of those. He didn't miss very many of those, so it's about 400, rough estimate.
Okay. What do you know about Officer Pettis' military training and experience?
He was infantry.
Excuse me, Your Honor, for a second.
Could we ask the foundation of how he knows this?
Sergeant Fox, how did you come to know Officer Pettis' military experience and training?
Through others. Officer Pettis is extremely humble, never talked about it, never told me really anything about his military career, but I had heard it from others that he had talked to.
Excuse me, Your Honor, again, hearsay.
Well, the question didn't actually call for hearsay at that time, but I'll allow him to continue, but I want to avoid any questions of what other people told him.
Okay. As a SWAT team sergeant, what value did Officer Pettis' military training and experience bring to you and your work as the SWAT team sergeant?
I found that combat veterans bring a clarity and calmness to extremely stressful situations. Critical incidents, very calm, good decision-making under fire.
Now, turning your attention to a different topic, and that is the training which SWAT team members undergo. To become a SWAT team member, what initial training must an applicant complete?
Basic SWAT school, that is a minimum of 120 hours. And that's test taking, lectures, practical scenarios, and that's just the bare minimum.
Now, once on the SWAT team, how often do SWAT team members train?
Minimum of once a week.
Now, what type of training takes place during the weekly SWAT training, team training?
We try to hit a variety of topics within the year, some of it being rescue, entry, apprehension, command and control, containment, firearms proficiency, defensive tactics, air operations, dignitary protection, active shooter training.
Now, in addition to in-house training, what role do outside providers play in providing the Albuquerque Police Department officers with SWAT team training?
Outside training is extremely important, just for the fact that with the topics that are growing out there in the United States, different ways of handling those situations, a lot of the schools that we send our officers to give them a broader base knowledge to deal with some of the incidents that are current events.
So it would be fair to say that there's both in-house training and there is training from outside organizations to assist SWAT officers in dealing with what the situations which they're asked to encounter.
Yes, sir.
Now, I'd like to ask you about the fundamentals about SWAT team training. What is the foundation upon which all SWAT team training is based?
Again, a SWAT team is a life-saving organization based on the tactics that we train and we teach. And with those, we try to handle all incidences with the least amount of force.
Would you please explain the concept known as contact cover?
Contact cover is the safest way to interview or make contact with subjects out in the field.
Now, would you please explain how a SWAT team uses the concept known as contact cover?
SWAT team uses the concept of contact cover the same as a field officer would use contact cover, except for with a SWAT team, we're a little bit more in orchestra with each other. We've worked around each other, we're more in concert with each other. A lot of times there's less verbal because we know what the other individual is going to do.
Now, how is the principle of contact cover taught to SWAT team officers?
It doesn't change that much from your academy experience. A cover officer is in charge of scene security. He will maintain the safety of the contact officer. The contact officer is the one doing the interrogating, the investigating, sometimes it'll be the talking back and forth with the subject. The cover officer watches the background. In case a shooting happens, he knows of his background. He's concerned with 180-degree security. He's watching the subject's hands, looking for any type of aggressive movement that may go to a concealed weapon. The cover officer will position himself in a place of advantage. He will watch any outside escape routes that the subject, if decides to run, he's on top of it. A lot of times the cover officer will only intervene to warn the contact officer of a threat. And that cover officer is also a lethal option if need be.
Now, you mentioned something that I want to ask you about, and that is the focus on the hands. Why are officers taught to focus on the hands as opposed to other areas of the body?
I've always been told, and from numerous schools, is that the hands are what's going to kill you. A hard stare from an individual won't hurt you, but hands, if you're not watching them, can go to a concealed area of your body and produce a weapon, or you may already have a weapon in your hands, so it's important to watch the hands.
Now, has Officer Pettis received the training you've just described?
Yes, quite extensively.
Now, turning back to the concept of contact cover, what is the downside of having a single officer serve both as the contact officer and as the cover officer?
There's a lot of multitasking. If you're covering contact, a lot of times you will give up some of that safety. If you're interviewing somebody or you're negotiating with somebody, there's times where you might not see those behavioral cues of the subject, which may hurt you.
Now, what's the benefit of the approach followed by a SWAT team of assigning specific tasks to one member of the team instead of assigning multiple tasks to a single member or other members?
We keep it simple. There is no multitasking. Each individual has their assignment, and every officer that is on an arrest team or in a contact, the other one will do, and most is nonverbal.
Now, focusing in your attention on the role of the contact officer, now, during a SWAT activation, I should ask, who makes contact with the suspect?
Preferably, crisis negotiators will make contact with the subject.
Now, who is tasked with the responsibility of being the cover officer?
A cover officer could be anybody on the team. A lot of times they will, if they just arrive or if they're there, they'll step up and they'll fill those roles. That's what the SWAT team practice continuously on: contact and cover, apprehension drills, scenarios with those apprehension drills, and guys know just exactly where to fill in where there may be a gap.
Now, turning your attention to a subtopic for cover officers, and that is the use of less lethal munitions by cover officers. What less lethal munitions are used by the Albuquerque Police Department SWAT team?
Beanbag rounds, taser, 40 millimeter impact munitions, skip-fire wood baton rounds, sponge rounds.
Now, how does an APD SWAT officer become trained in the use of less lethal munitions?
There's lectures, there's written tests, there's practicals, there's an outside organization that will come and we send our officers to. They have to show proficiency, they have to pass the written test, and then once a year or twice a year we use a
use of multiple less lethal munitions.
layered response.
Okay. Now, why does a SWAT team use a layered, less lethal response when dealing with an individual who is armed, possibly dangerous?
With a layered response, there's a lot of times you have a more successful outcome because you have more than one less lethal tool available to you. Through my training and experience, less lethal tools often fail. So if you have one tool that fails, you're able to have another tool or another tool in the hopes of successfully resolving the situation.
Now, how can a layered, less lethal response prevent the use of deadly force?
Well, with a layered response, it actually starts with your presence all the way up to deadly force, and we have the ability to fluidly de-escalate and escalate. With the multiple layers of less lethal, it gives us that ability to have a more positive outcome if one, two of the less lethal options fail. Then we may have a less lethal tool that can incapacitate the individual, and we can take them into custody peacefully.
Now, how does the Albuquerque Police Department train its SWAT officers to perform a less lethal response?
Various training, once again, lectures, written tests. We have scenarios. We do apprehension training with K-9. We will have all the different uses of force, and guys will work in concert with each other through those various uses of force.
Now, has Officer Pettis received this training?
He has.
Now, how often has the Albuquerque Police Department used a layered, less lethal response in real-world situations?
Every call-out, we try to use it. Every call-out, we have a plan already in place to use that.
Okay. And has that been your experience during the many years you've been a SWAT team officer and a SWAT team sergeant?
It has, sir.
Has Officer Pettis been involved in some of those incidents in which a layered, less lethal munitions response was planned and actually executed?
He has.
Now, I'd like to turn your attention to a different subtopic, and that is the use of deadly force by cover officers. Why are cover officers equipped with firearms?
In case there is a need for a lethal response, the subject produces a weapon and puts the cover officer, contact officer in harm, or a citizen.
Now, why is a firearm necessary if you have a layered, less lethal response already prepared?
Because less lethal fails. It's technology, and technology has a habit of failing.
Now, what does the APD SWAT team teach about the role of an officer with a firearm serving as a cover officer?
That officer is a cover officer with the firearm. He's a lethal option. And once again, he is doing all of those factors that I explained. He's watching the hands, he's watching behavioral cues. He's monitoring what's going on with the scene, but doesn't have to necessarily communicate unless there's a deadly force situation.
Now, what training did Officer Pettis receive regarding the proper response when a cover officer sees an immediate deadly threat posed to another officer?
It starts basic academy training all the way up into SWAT or tactical training. And there's nothing fancy about any of the tactical training. It's just doing the basics well, doing the basics quickly if need be.
And so what is the training in terms of the response that's expected of a tactical team officer who sees a threat of immediate deadly threat posed to another officer?
To deploy lethal force.
How is that principle taught?
Once again, range time, we have decisional targets, we have scenarios, we have actual scenarios where officers are able to engage each other with the kind of a plastic rounds, ammunition rounds, and within all this training, we put the officer through threats and things that are not threats.
Okay.
And they must make snap decisions.
Now, before we actually talk about some of those principles, I'd like to also form a foundation about your qualifications to teach firearms courses. Now, when did you first become a New Mexico Department of Public Safety certified firearms instructor?
Boy, off the top of my head, 2001, 2002.
Okay. Which firearms has the New Mexico Department of Public Safety certified you to teach?
Shotgun, rifle, pistol.
Okay. How similar are the New Mexico Department of Public Safety firearms instructions when compared to the instruction that you give the Albuquerque Police Department SWAT team?
They're exactly the same.
Okay. So there's no changes between what the Department of Public Safety requires and what you require of your officers during your training?
No, and I go back to the statement is that there is no fancy training, there is no magic when teaching SWAT officers. It's just doing the basics well. knowing those basics, doing them in your sleep, it's become second nature.
Now, I'd like to talk about the firearms training which has been provided to the Albuquerque Police Department SWAT team and that you've had personal knowledge that it's actually been given. First, what is follow-through firearms marksmanship?
Follow-through is the last part of the 7 steps of marksmanship. Follow-through is all of the things you do to make that bullet, when it leaves the chamber, hit its intended target.
How is that principle taught?
Repetitiveness, as we go through training after training day, firearms range days, lecture. Like I said, it starts when the officer is in the academy.
Now, what is a defensive response in firearms training?
A defensive response is 2 rounds, high center mass.
Now, how is that principle taught?
Starts in the academy once again, lectures, written tests, square range, and then there are some scenarios and practicals that you do throughout your career. Then SWAT, we increase all of those. We do numerous more scenarios, lots more training is with an officer making those snap decisions.
What is a failure drill?
Failure drill is a standard defensive response, assessing, and if need be, follow up with another shot to stop the action.
Now, how is that principle taught?
The same as the defensive response.
Now, what is a reactive target versus a non-reactive target?
A reactive target, and we have them, they're metal targets, and sometimes we're able to use cardboard targets, a target that reacts when the officer engages it. And when it reacts, it disappears or falls, thus stopping the action.
Now, explain of what value to a SWAT officer it is to actually be taught with using reactive targets.
Reactive target gives you something to gauge. Are your hits good? It stops the action. The target disappears. If the target doesn't disappear, your hits could be bad, or it could be just that the subject their action hasn't stopped.
Now, what types of decisional shooting drills do SWAT officers do for practice?
Numerous entry training. We'll set up different rooms and a structure, place different types of targets with weapons in hands. Some will be no weapons in hands, combination of shoot, don't shoot, decisional type targets.
Why is it important to teach a SWAT officer, or any officer for that matter, the concept of shoot, don't shoot using targets?
Because it would be a great disservice if you taught officers to shoot every target that was put in front of them. That's not real world. Real world is not everybody's a threat. Not everybody has become a threat when dealing with them.
Now, what types of targets, specific targets, do you use to actually show the various types of threats and non-threats that an officer may encounter in real-world experience?
Once again, there are picture targets. Some are illustrated, some are photography, and we have the ability to place weapons in their hands, put just regular items in their hands. So the officer has to deal with these targets, watch the hands, and make the appropriate decision. Not everything that we put in a subject's hands that's on the target is a deadly force situation.
What's an example of putting something in a target's hands that is not a deadly threat?
I know there are several targets we have that are a camera, radio, a newspaper, a phone, real-world items that an officer may encounter on the street.
What targets do you use that help an officer assess edge weapons threats?
Same type of targets, except for the hands will have an edged weapon.
Based on the training that you give SWAT officers, what is the response that you expect from an officer who is presented with a target that has an edged weapon in its hands?
Deploy lethal force,
And why is that?
because it is putting that officer, another officer that may be with that officer, and citizen safety, all of those are in jeopardy.
Now, turning your attention to basically the use of the aiming system that a weapon has, please explain the concept of sight picture as you have taught it and others have taught it to the Albuquerque Police Department SWAT team.
Sight picture starts with the sight alignment, the rear sight, the front sight, and then the intended target. And then, of course, it goes along with all the 7 steps of marksmanship. During a critical incident or an actual deploying of a weapon, that front sight now becomes, say, flash sight, front sight picture.
So when you say flash sight, what do you mean by that?
There's various things that happens when a weapon discharges, and your body has to react. Your eye can only see on one focal plane. You have a rear sight, your front sight, and then the intended.
Excuse me, Sergeant Fox. Your Honor, I'm going to object. I think it's cumulative of Ron McCarthy's testimony. This person has not been identified as an expert in shooting or firearms, and I think he's going into the same things that their expert witness, Ron McCarthy, testified about, and I think that's improper.
Mr. Robles responds?
One, this is the training which Officer Pettis actually received, which Mr. McCarthy could not testify to. And then we're also talking about something that Mr. McCarthy did not testify to, and that is the flash sight picture and how one acquires it. And so it's not cumulative, and also this is what's being taught. So this is what Officer Pettis, would essentially take with him to the incident involving Mr. Boyd.
What about the other objection as far as his expertise? The state complains that you haven't laid the sufficient foundation for that.
Given the almost, I believe it's 15 years in working as a SWAT team officer, his certifications as a firearms instructor with the Department of Public Safety, and what makes this more probative than not is essentially this is the training which Officer Pettis received, that this is a witness who is qualified by experience and training to provide testimony about what Officer Pettis was taught.
I'll allow him to testify as to what Officer Pettis was taught in this particular area. I think that there is some foundation laid to show that this witness has sufficient expertise to talk about that, so go ahead.
Now, to be clear, what you just testified to is what you know Officer Pettis has been taught.
Yes, it's in the actual DPS lecture. It's basic firearms knowledge.
Okay. Now, what was taught to Officer Pettis about where the sight should be placed?
It'll be high center mass and hold.
Okay. What was Officer Pettis taught about how the lethal cover officer's eye focus on a target? I guess I'm butchering that question. Would you please explain what Officer Pettis was taught about how he should focus his eyes on a target?
And it goes along with the flash sight picture. You're concentrating on the front sight. You're unable to look at the rear sight, front sight, and the intended target. The front sight, or in a case of an aim point, the optic dot should be so clear that it actually puts a target or an intended target kind of fuzzy. But it's always been described to me, and I see it, as your front sight, you should be able to, if you have just an iron sight, be able to count the hash marks on the front sight. Or in the red dot system, you should be able to see that dot crystal clear.
What difference is there between training an officer about flash sight pictures between iron sights versus an aiming system?
There's no difference.
Okay. why does the Albuquerque Police Department SWAT team officers use aiming systems instead of iron sights?
The aiming systems help us acquire that front sight quicker. Our response times are a little faster.
Now, turning your attention to the incident that you were called to at 812 Piedra Vista Road Northeast, how did you find out that an incident was occurring in the city's open space?
Radio control gave me a call on my cell phone, my department-issued cell phone.
What did you learn about the incident that was occurring at 812 Piedra Vista Northeast?
At the time was around 1737. I remember I was at the mall with my family, and dispatcher explained that there was a situation in the Foothills Area Command, individual in the open space area, negotiating with officers, armed with knives, some mental illness reported, and was refusing to follow their instructions and was making comments that he was going to kill them, wasn't going to come down for them.
Okay. Why were you called? All right. Do you know why you were called?
A lot of times we're called as supervisors to monitor a situation, or they give us kind of a heads up of a situation that might be occurring in the city.
At this point, was the incident happening in the open space? Was it a SWAT call out, as it's known?
It was not.
Okay. Now, what I'd like to do, with the court's permission, is to play a portion of the radio tape. That's Exhibit C2. It's an exhibit that was already admitted into evidence during the testimony of Detective Stone, along with Exhibit D3, which is a transcript of the 911 recording, a transcript of the 911 recording call. And I'd like to lay some foundation for that, because that has yet to be entered into evidence.
Okay.
Did you have an opportunity to review Exhibit D3, which is the transcript of the APD dispatch recording?
I did.
Did you have an opportunity to compare Exhibit C2, which is the APD radio tape, with Exhibit D3, the transcript of the APD dispatch recording?
I did.
When reading the transcript marked as Exhibit D3, did you note any changes, additions, or deletions?
No.
Okay. Is Exhibit D3 a true and accurate transcript of the APD radio dispatch that you heard on March the 16th, 2014?
It is.
Your Honor, at this time, I'd like to play a portion of APD radio tape, which is Exhibit C2, along with Exhibit D3, the 911 recording call, or the transcript thereof, page 19, line 25, through page 22, line 7.
I think there are no objections to that.
No objection, Your Honor.
10-4, subject is -29, but he is coming back on CIT with extensive criminal history, aggravated battery on peace officers in various jurisdictions, paranoid schizophrenic, and a transient. He is showing a lot of criminal activity, 2011, criminal damage, aggravated battery assault, a few 1040 POTs, and veteran of peace officer at least in 2007.
Now, talking about what you just heard, what does -29 mean?
Negative 29 is no outstanding warrants.
Okay. Now, upon hearing that Mr. Boyd had an extensive criminal history, including aggravated battery on a peace officer, what did this information tell you about the level of threat which Mr. Boyd posed to the responding officers?
The level of threat was extremely high.
Now, based on your experience, what is the difference between a suspect who has committed an aggravated battery against a citizen when compared to a person who has committed an aggravated battery against an officer?
Based on my experience through my career, when confronting an individual who is willing to use force against an officer, that's usually an extremely high threat. Most individuals in our society conform or talk with uniformed officers, but when you actually have someone who is willing to attack or willing to engage in threatening behavior towards officers, that puts it at a very high level.
Now, I understand that you spoke to APD K-9 officer Ken Ronzone over the telephone. Is that correct?
I did.
What did you learn from your telephone call with Officer Ronzone?
Objection, hearsay, Your Honor.
I'm going to sustain the objection. It is hearsay.
After speaking to the members of your unit, I understand you also spoke to Jason Carpenter, is that right?
I did.
What information did Sergeant Carpenter provide you that helped you assess what was happening at the location?
My first conversation with him is he was extremely confident that they had the situation under control. Told him I had more resources to provide him. He said it wouldn't be necessary, that he had everything he needed out at the scene.
What concerns did it raise in your mind, having heard the initial call about Mr. Boyd, comparing it with what Sergeant Carpenter told you about his assessment?
Well, based on my experience in the open space area, I knew that would be a difficult area to negotiate with somebody, a different area, different problems that open space presents, the terrain. I knew that a perimeter would be tough. I also knew that it was getting close to evening. The subject's background was violent, and when his actions were violent at the time, so it concerned me.
While en route, I understand you requested that additional SWAT officers respond, is that correct?
I did.
Which SWAT officers did you contact?
Contacted James Perdue, Ramon Ornelas, and Dominic Perez.
Why did you contact Officer James Perdue?
James Perdue has a skill set that is different from other individuals on the team. He is a high ground officer, so he's able to deploy and conceal himself. He's able to deploy at a distance, and with the magnification on his weapon system, he's able to provide me back at the command post or where I may be, and other officers at the scene, a great amount of intel.
Now, why did you ask for Officer Ramon Ornelas to respond?
Ramon Ornelas is a team leader. That function on the team is, it's not a rank, but it's a leadership position. Ramon was a team leader. He would come up with plans, assist me with dealing with high-stress incidents, and he has a vast amount of experience.
You also asked Officer Pettis to respond. Why is that?
Again, with my experience when training and in real-world situations with Dominic, I found him to be very calm under fire, under critical incidences. He made great decisions, and I could always rely on him to make those good decisions.
Now, turning your attention to the information learned over the radio about Mr. Boyd's current charges, what I'd like to do now is to play a portion of Exhibit C2, the APD radio tape, and also concurrently also show Exhibit D3, the transcript of the 911 recording, page 27, line 45 through page 27, line 25.
754 to 1055, 1040, felony aggravated assault on 34 charges. At this point, I think it's going to be a negative. 29 to 5456. 54. As myself and 35 city shooters have just southeast of the subject, halfway up the hillside. We have a visual of the subject in sleep leads. So forth. 56 is 10-4. 756 to 754. And your responding units. 25 were the primary units. Officers contacted the subject. Subject was non-compliant, refusing to show his hands. And then officers attempted to contact him and pat him down. He pulled one knife out and threatened him in a threatening manner. Also made threats to kill him. Subject is armed with at least 2 knives, at which point probably open and in his front pockets, and he used them more than once.
Who is 754?
754 would be Officer Ken Ronzone.
Who
Or,
is,
excuse me, 754, it'd be, I'm sorry, Scott Weimerskirch.
now who is Sam 55?
Sam 55 would have been Jason Carpenter.
So is it fair to say that it was Officer Weimerskirch who was calling Sergeant Carpenter over the air?
I'd have to look at it again, I believe it was 756
Okay.
was calling some of the individuals over the air, just from the radio transcripts, and that would have been Ken Ronzone.
All right, so your recollection is that it was Officer Ken Ronzone calling Sergeant Carpenter over the air.
Yes.
And what does a felony aggravated assault on a 34 charges mean?
Means a subject has brandished a weapon, has become a deadly threat, and has presented that weapon in a threatening manner, or even striked at a officer.
Now, you had mentioned that 756 is Officer Ronzone, is that right?
756 is Officer
So-
Ronzone.
What does 756 to 754 and any responding units mean?
It means that Ken Ronzone, 756, is relaying information directly to 754, who is at a different location, and other responding units or other units out on the perimeter, he's wanting to get important information out to them, so that's how he starts his broadcast, so everybody knows that there's important information coming, so we're all on the same sheet of music.
What does 25 mean?
Contact.
Okay. Upon hearing that Mr. Boyd had committed aggravated battery on the responding officers, what did this information tell you about the level of threat which Mr. Boyd posed to the responding officers?
It was a highly elevated threat.
Now, in listening to the radio tape, there was information provided by Sergeant Carpenter, is that right?
Yes.
Now, what did you learn from, based on what Sergeant Carpenter said, what did you learn about the possible criminal charges against Mr. Boyd?
Sergeant Carpenter was not aware of possible felony charges.
Now, what troubled you about Sergeant Carpenter's conclusion that there were not charges?
Well, one of the main reasons I started, because I was informed that there were charges, there were felony charges, and on top of that, the incident that was at hand.
Now, what did Officer Ronzone tell you about those charges?
Officer Ronzone explained that there was contact being made with field officers and the subject, and at some point they had the charges of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon.
Why did you value the information you received from Officer Ronzone over the information you received from Sergeant Carpenter?
Officer Ronzone, through my experience, he's an experienced officer, a veteran officer. I've worked with him for years. He's another one that makes good decisions, and he knows situations where a response of a SWAT nature or of a canine nature, what we need as far as SOP.
Now, why did you ask for an impact detective to show up to the scene?
Because of my dealings with Sergeant Carpenter, I needed to get a little bit of the details worked out. I had an incident, regardless of the charges, I still had to deal with that incident. But the charges were there, but I needed an impact detective to come, start making some interviews, and if need be, start getting warrants.
Okay. Now I'd like to ask you about the staging by the Albuquerque Fire Department. To do that, I'd like to play Exhibit C2, the APD radio tape, along with Exhibit D3, the transcript of the 911 recording, page 25 through line 18, or page 25, line 18 through page 26, line 3.
Albuquerque Fire Department to APD Command. Do you have a designated training location for us? Okay, so we take care of we want to copper and center.
In check so the staging area will be at Copper and Charter.
Albuquerque Fire Department, I see a copy in the area, copper and center.
Why does the Albuquerque Police Department call the Albuquerque Fire Department to respond to incidents like this?
Because if need be, if medical treatment is necessary, their quick response being on the scene, you can't beat it. It beats them at the firehouse or somewhere else and being dispatched.
Approximately how far away was the Albuquerque Fire Department Rescue Unit staged away from the location where the standoff was occurring with Mr. Boyd?
Roughly that area would maybe be 100 yards by service road.
Based on your knowledge of the area, what allowed the Albuquerque Fire Department to travel from the staging area at Copper and Turner to the location where the standoff was occurring?
There's an open space service road and paths.
Now, upon your arrival in the open space, what did you learn about the terrain that you had to essentially address and encounter?
The terrain brought many difficulties. It was rough, there was elevated positions. The lighting hampered us. Our footing was hampered by the lighting and the rocks and the shrubs. And then on top of that, around the rough terrain, you had a Sunday afternoon, which was frequented by many citizens and people enjoying the outdoors. And they were coming down from the peak and using the trails.
What is it about Mr. Boyd's position that caused you to be concerned and essentially want this to become a SWAT call?
He had a position of advantage. He was in an elevated position. From my position down at the house in the backyard, I was able to look up and see him every once in a while move to a position that was elevated, then he would come down a little bit, and then the terrain made it extremely difficult to set any kind of inner perimeter.
Now, what is it about having a higher position that gives the individual in that higher position an advantage over the officers who are below the suspect?
He's able to see all of our locations. It's hard for officers to conceal themselves.
What problems did the setting sun pose for the officers?
The setting sun was a huge problem just because of, again, the inner perimeter. No matter how tight we could try to get it, based on the terrain and the open field, it'd be very easily to slip through that. And like I said, there was citizens all about, walking down, walking on the path, and then you had a neighborhood directly to the west that was a great concern. The sun setting would have limited us as far as lighting the scene up. Unfortunately, most of the vehicles, because of the terrain, would have a hard time getting into a position and lighting the subject up with a spotlight. A lot of our powered lights would be hampered because of no power sources or power sources that were extremely far.
How much ambient light was available for the officers who were there speaking to Mr. Boyd?
There was the lighting close would be, if you were dealing with someone close, was sufficient. You could see.
Okay. Now, the process of making the standoff with Mr. Boyd into a SWAT call-out, that's what I'd like to talk about next. Now, after assessing the standoff with Mr. Boyd, I understand that you knew that there were canine officers there, is that correct?
I did.
And that there were field officers who were deployed with less lethal, is that right?
I did.
And that officers that were making contact with Mr. Boyd were being supervised by a sergeant, is that right?
That's correct.
So why did you believe it was important to turn this call involving Mr. Boyd into a SWAT call-out?
The call presented a lot of problems. It was an extremely difficult call. And by RSLP, I considered it a barricaded subject just based on the terrain.
What do you mean barricaded subject? Why is Mr. Boyd in a barricaded position?
He was in a position of advantage where putting officers at a disadvantage, just like if an individual was barricaded in a structure, they have somewhat of an advantage by the concealment of their walls and the fortification of their walls, where officers are not available or not provided that same coverage.
Now, what resources could a SWAT team officer that weren't already there?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
What resources could a SWAT team call out or SWAT team activation provide to the situation involving Mr. Boyd that weren't already there?
Well, the SWAT team call out, you have officers that work in sync with each other, in concert with each other, and train together, are fluid. And then along with that call, you provide numerous resources. You provide a crisis negotiation team that is also equipped with a psychologist and a scribe, and then more negotiators.
Now, what did you learn about the estimated time of arrival of the crisis negotiations team?
I was never given any time of when they were to arrive.
Now, I'd like to discuss the issue of perimeter. Why is the use of a perimeter important in your line of work?
Perimeter keeps a situation from growing, spilling over, engulfing more of a neighborhood or causing more of a problem. The quicker you're establishing an inner perimeter, the better it is, the safer it is, because now you contain it to just one small area.
Now, there's an outer perimeter and an inner perimeter. Is that right?
That's correct.
What is an outer perimeter?
An outer perimeter will keep traffic, pedestrian traffic, and keep people from entering that outer perimeter now into the space between the inner perimeter and the outer perimeter. So it's another perimeter that kind of expands the scene a little bit more and allows you to work within that inner perimeter and that outer perimeter with resources and moving officers.
Now, upon your arrival, what did you see about the creation of an outer perimeter?
I wasn't exactly sure where our outer perimeter was. I felt like I was kind of doing a little bit of catch up, getting to the scene, figuring out outer perimeter positions, inner perimeter positions.
What did you do to create an outer perimeter?
I worked on the inner perimeter first, just because that is the most important, to keep that situation contained, and then with time work on an outer perimeter. So I began looking at what I had as far as resources on the inner perimeter, where officers were staged, what tools they may have. Do I have layers of response with each position, which would be less lethal? What could the officer see from their position? Did I have enough at the scene to keep it contained? It was my concern.
Now, I failed to ask, and I should ask, what is the inner perimeter and what is its purpose?
The inner perimeter would be the perimeter around the critical incident, the scene where interaction is going on, or it could even be a chemical spill. That inner perimeter is right there, keeping that contained.
Okay. Now, after assessing the situation, you began to work on the inner perimeter, is that right?
That's correct.
What decisions did you make about what resources were needed to bolster the inner perimeter?
Again, I was concerned about less lethal options, manpower options, and does each position require another individual? Each position, are you able to contain that area, or are you going to need an additional perimeter units to the west or to the east or to the south to keep this from growing?
Now, with regard to Officer Pettis, what decisions did you make about the role that you wanted him to undertake in creating the inner perimeter?
Officer Weimer-Scourge needed more individuals in his position. I felt that I had kind of a skeleton crew, per se, on my inner perimeter, so I needed to start fortifying the makeshift arrest team where Officer Weimer-Scourge was at, and he asked for an additional body, so that's where I sent Officer Perez.
Now, what role did you give Officer Pettis when you sent him to the inner perimeter surrounding Mr. Boyd?
With tactical officers, I don't have to really give them a whole lot of information. He knows what to do when he gets up there. I said, please go assist Officer Weimer-Scourge, and based on what his experience has shown me, that he would go up there and fill in whatever position he needed to fill in.
Of the officers who were there, why did you choose Officer Pettis to go to the inner perimeter as opposed to the other tactical officers who were there at the scene?
Other tactical officers that were already at the scene were deployed on the inner perimeter already. Again, Officer Perdue had already deployed in a high ground position, and so the next two that walked up, Officer Perez, Officer Ramon Ornelas walked up, and I was going to send both of those individuals up to where Officer Weimer-Skirch was requesting additional manpower.
What are the expectations that you and the SWAT team places on a team member who serves as a cover officer who sees an immediate deadly threat posed to an officer or another?
To deploy deadly force.
And now, are those the expectations you sent Officer Pettis up with in dealing with Mr. Boyd?
They were nonverbal, but those are the expectations I expect him.
Now, what role does an arrest team play in a SWAT activation?
An arrest team is kind of that force array, that term where an arrest team, just by mere presence, all the way up to deadly force, and you have all of the options in the middle, and they can fluidly escalate, de-escalate if necessary. And an arrest team will have usually someone who will make contact. You will have cover officer, and then you will have various individuals with less lethal, and you may have another individual that is what we call hands-on. He'll be the individual to place the individual into custody.
Now, based on what you saw happening on that mountain, is it your assessment that what you had in place in the inner perimeter was an arrest team?
Based on,
Objection, leaving, Your Honor.
I'm sorry, what was your objection?
Leaving, Your Honor.
Rephrase your question, please.
Based on your training and experience, what was your assessment as to whether the individuals who were in the inner perimeter were serving as an arrest team?
Same objection, Your Honor.
Could you rephrase the question, counsel, please? It does suggest an answer.
Based on your training and experience, would you please explain what you viewed the role of the inner perimeter officers as in dealing with Mr. Boyd?
inner perimeter officers, I need an arrest team, I need inner perimeter teams, and through conversation, because of where I was located, I was informed I need individuals on our arrest team. That to me was the most important part, or the most important element at the time, is to get more bodies to that individual who's requesting them on the arrest team. Whatever the officer on the arrest team saw or needed, he's able to make those decisions, and I don't need to get on the air and do a lot of verbal communication and tie up the air. If that individual says, this is what I need, I can give them those resources quickly.
Now, I'm going to turn your attention to the information that was relayed by Officer Weimer-Skirch during his attempt to negotiate with Mr. Boyd. And to do that, I'm going to play Exhibit C2, the APD radio tape, and also refer to the transcript, Exhibit D3, page 33, line 22 through line 23.
Faculty just advised, subject's still highly irate, refusing to come down, talks about hostile killing officers, and making other temporary comments.
Upon hearing that Mr. Boyd had told officers that he would kill him, what did this information tell you about the level of threat which Mr. Boyd posed?
It was extremely high level of threat that was coming over the air, that I was concerned about a successful resolution.
How dangerous is a suspect who threatens to kill officers while armed with a weapon?
Very.
Now I'm going to play for you a second report by Officer Weimer-Skirch, and to do that using Exhibit C2, the APD radio tape, along with Exhibit D3, the transcript, referring to page 36, line 3 through 18.
Faculty.
754.
Negotiations start productive, and you see it for the 17th on here.
6710.
Good. Okay, good. Not getting anywhere with any negotiations with them, highly agitated, making 1040 comments, and we're going to lose table 8.
Now again, 754 is Officer Weimerskirch,
That's correct.
and you're 710.
That's correct.
When you heard that Officer Weimerskirch was not getting anywhere with negotiations, what does that tell you about the likelihood of anyone successfully resolving the incident through negotiations?
It was going to be highly unlikely that it would be successful, no matter what negotiator we may bring in.
Now, turning your attention to the final phase of the standoff with Mr. Boyd, I'd like to play another portion of the APD radio tape, Exhibit C2, and also referring to the transcript, which is Exhibit D3, beginning at page 43, line 7, through page 45, line 1.
The subject said he wants to get his bags and walk down the soccer line, won't disarm himself. We have a plan in place if he comes toward us. I'm going to stay off the radio if he's making movements at this time. 22, will you call out his movement for me? Top part if I can get additional eyes up here. Yep, I've got two. I'll send them up to you. Is it going to be okay if I send them straight up to you, or do they need to go in a certain direction? Straight up to us. He's talking about grabbing his bags and coming down, which is, that could be compliant with any commands to be taken into custody. I confirm. Do you have enough left to report that? That's 10-4. We're just going to try to keep him occupied and have him find taken into custody. Okay, you have enough left to report there? So since he just changed clothing, he's now wearing a gray sweatshirt. It's pretty thick clothing, looks like it's a hamper, any kind of taser. And a 5-4. 5-4. I never got an answer. Do you have enough left to report there? Negative. We can have a 10 packs, let's see. Okay, I'll send the taser shotgun up to you. Sorry, I don't see the shotgun. We need a beanbag. And we're going to need it quick. Tempo.
Upon hearing that Mr. Boyd wants to get his bags and walk down, but is not compliant, won't disarm himself, what concerns did that raise in your mind?
Officer safety and citizen safety.
Why couldn't you just simply let Mr. Boyd walk down the hill and walk down, along the trail?
Because of the citizen safety I was talking about with the path and the individuals coming down from the crest, the neighborhood, and then a moving inner perimeter is extremely difficult. It would be a hazardous to civilians, to other officers, just because of crossfires.
Okay, so when you say a mobile perimeter is dangerous, and you also mentioned the term crossfire, why is a mobile perimeter a danger to the officers who are actually manning the perimeter?
Because as the moving perimeter is moving, the subject's dictating the movements. We're not in control. So he can move, he can run, he can dart, and it's going to be extremely difficult to align that perimeter safely to protect citizens, to avoid crossfire with other officers.
Please explain the problem posed by crossfire.
Crossfire is when there is movement, quick movement, lack of communication, or communication just wasn't available quick enough where if an officer needs to engage a subject, his background is another officer or a citizen.
Now, why did you ask Officer Weimerskirch if he had enough less lethal?
Again, I was concerned about the layers of less lethal, the tools, more tools the better.
Okay. What did Officer Weimerskirch say in response to your question?
He needed a beanbag shotgun.
Please explain the steps that you took to provide Officer Weimerskirch with the beanbag shotgun requested.
Officer Perez, Officer Ramon and Ellis were down at the backyard area where I was positioned. I looked at them, I asked, I need a beanbag shotgun up there quickly. Officer Ramon said, I have one in my car, it's right there, I'll go back and get one. And that's when he went back to his car to retrieve that.
Now, turning your attention to the efforts to take Mr. Boyd into custody, I'd like to go ahead and play Exhibit C2, the APD radio tape, along with the transcript, Exhibit D3, page 46, line 10 through 19.
Just advised, not complying with any commands, be taken into custody. He wants to draw on the head with all his bags. Is it 14 out there? And he's going to be with a beanbag. Whenever you guys come up with a plan, as much as possible, or an act law to take you into custody for his safety and ours. That's the plan.
Now, you would agree with me that that portion of the radio tape seems to repeat a longer portion of the radio tape we heard previously.
That's correct.
Now, why was the information repeated?
To show the urgency of what was occurring up at the top of where the arrest team was at.
Now, turning your attention to the final phase of this incident, as Officer Ornelas is moving towards Mr. Boyd with the beanbag shotgun, what did you hear?
I heard what sounded like a noise flash diversionary device, along with commands to a police canine, and then what it sounded like, but I wasn't sure if it was a volley of gunshots.
Now, how close was Officer Ornelas to Mr. Boyd's location when the flashbang deployed?
He was probably maybe 50 yards from getting to the top of where they were at.
Now, I'd like to show another exhibit, Exhibit B4, which is an exhibit that was previously admitted, Alexer Thixton's video. And I'd like to show a clip of that from the 59-minute, 18-second mark to the 1 hour, 1 minute, and 16-second mark. As this video is playing, you see an officer running up.
I do.
Who is that?
That would be Officer Ramon Ornelas.
Turning your attention to another issue, and that is the immediate efforts to bring medical personnel to Mr. Boyd. I'd like to play for you Exhibit C2, which is the APD radio tape, along with the transcript, which is Exhibit D3, going to page 47, line 10, through page 48, line 7.
All right, he's regathered his camp. Taken Mr. Boyd, Leslie Phillips. Andrew's moving 22 down. 1522B, camp 4355. Try location.
You check where you're the one that's different of 812 teacher and stuff.
AFD was directly behind me. Same route into foothills.
10-4.
Operator of the fire department registered AP command. How would you like us to come up there? If you can follow that dirt road that I just went up.
710.
Okay, we're gonna have shots fired. All 34 at this time are 10-4. We're gonna have to start picking them up in the air. And you have 4355, step on, and you have to come up to our position.
Temporary FC is on the way as we are currently on the temporary.
So what does 22 down mean?
22 is a high ground officer, as I explained. When he makes the statement, "I'm down," that means he's coming off of his weapon, so he's not covering officers.
Now, what is 4355?
That's going to be Albuquerque, there's going to be rescue, ambulance, moving to the location.
So, what is your understanding, based on your time at this location, about what rescue and ambulance were doing?
They were on standby.
So, how quickly was rescue able to go to Mr. Boyd's location?
They were quick. By the time while doing on the radio transmissions, they were right there, coming up the service road.
In Your Honor, an administrative matter, and I want to make sure I didn't make a mistake. If my recollection serves me right, this court admitted into evidence Exhibit D3. Is that correct?
Can you look real quick? Hang on.
This is the state's exhibit, or defense exhibit?
Yes. You said D3?
D3, the transcript of the 911 recording, which I believe the state had no objection to.
I'll show on her form D1, but I don't see a D3.
I don't see D3 either in my notes.
Your Honor, I can lay a foundation for that document to have
Okay.
it to be allowed into evidence.
Go ahead.
Unless, of course, the state has no objection.
No objection.
You said no objection?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, it'll be admitted.
May I take a moment to confer, Your Honor?
Okay.
No further questions. Pass the witness, Your Honor.
Mr. Bregman?
Good morning, Sergeant.
Good morning, sir.
I want to follow up on a few things that Mr. Robles asked you about. Would you agree with me that you didn't hear any transmissions from Detective Sandy at the time?
I don't recall.
While you were up
hearing-
there at the scene, is that correct?
That's correct. I don't recall hearing any.
Would you also agree with me that basically your understanding was that Officer Weimerskirts was developing that plan and kind of leading that effort as far as the plan, correct?
Based on radio conversation, I did.
And that, as you just said, that was based on radio conversation and knowing that he's a K-9 officer and was up there, is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
Okay.
No, I'm going to object to leading. I understand that technically, Mr. Robles called this witness, but in fact, both of these people are in a joint defense, and I think this is a person who's affiliated with one side or the other, so I'll object on leading.
I'm going to overrule the objection because this is Mr. Robles' witness, and I think counsel has a right to cross-examine him, so go ahead, I'll allow the leading questions.
Thank you. So, tell me a little bit about your understanding about, in other words, a K-9 officer, Officer Weimerskirts was kind of leading that plan or that contact at the point, right? Is there any significance that he's a K-9 officer in doing that in your mind?
Yes, there is. Based on his call sign, and when it came out, I knew who that 754 was Officer Scott Weimerskirts. I knew from experience with working with him and based on training environments that he would be capable of handling that situation. He's been on countless hundreds of situations similar, and kind of the role of a tactical officer doesn't have to be rank when they get to a scene, is try to control that scene, contain that scene, and do as much as they can to prevent it from growing.
And would you agree with me that basically he was communicating to you, as we've already heard on over the radio, that he was developing a plan?
That's correct, sir.
And your understanding was developing a plan to use a non-lethal force to take Mr. Boyd into custody, correct?
There was a plan that he had in place.
Okay. Now, at the time, let me back up. Have you met Officer Sandy before this?
I have, sir.
And did you do any training with him in SWAT?
Countless hours.
In what capacity, can you tell the court a little bit about that?
Sure.
So, Your Honor, beyond the scope of the direct by Mr. Robles.
Sustained, Mr. Bregman, if you want to go into your client, you're going to have to call him in your case.
Okay. All right,
Okay?
that's fine. So, let's get back then to the scene and your training and experience. Tell me the things that you were learning that concerned you specifically about the threat to police officers in close proximity to Mr. Boyd.
There was a great threat, just based on radio communication. My inner perimeter probably wasn't the best. My arrest team, which was Officer Weimer-Skirch, was in need of more manpower, needed more tools. His radio comments were that the subject was non-compliant, was going to come down on his terms. So it was not looking very good as far as a successful outcome.
Do you have an understanding now that Keith Sandy was a cover officer in this particular matter?
I do now.
Okay. And specifically, what are you trained as a cover officer, his sole responsibility is?
Again, Your Honor, beyond the scope of direct examination.
No, there was great.
No, I believe this was discussed in the direct. I'll allow the question to be asked and answered.
What is your understanding of what the sole responsibility of a cover officer is in a situation as was posed up on that mountain?
Cover officer is to maintain scene security. He's to watch the subject, watch behavioral cues that could be aggressive, the 180-degree security, watch for possible escape routes, to not intervene during the negotiations or communications with the contact officer unless...
If I could stop you there. The cover officer is not supposed to engage with the subject, correct?
That's correct.
He's not supposed to have a conversation with him, correct?
Only if there is an immediate threat, then he can relay it to the
And I think you've said this
contact.
already, but to kind of put it in context, a cover officer is, for example, watching that subject's hands to make sure he understands what's going on and whether or not that's posing any immediate deadly threat to the officer that he is to protect, right?
That is correct, sir.
And I don't have to ask if can you hold that just for a second?
Yes, sir.
I'm going to represent to you that this is 9 feet that I'm standing right here, and this is approximately 8 feet right here, okay?
Okay, sir.
Now, based on your training and understanding, these are fake knives, if you will.
Okay.
Your Honor, I'm going to object. I think this is also beyond the scope of direct.
Response?
Your Honor, I don't believe it's beyond the scope of directive. He talked at great length about his training, and I'm asking specifically about his training. He was asked questions about posing deadly threats. He was asked questions about knives, as whether or not they're considered a deadly threat. Your Honor, I think it's consistent.
Well, if you're going to ask him if this particular distance created a dangerous threat at the scene, I mean, he's testified to the fact about the scene being dangerous, but I'll allow that question if that's what you're getting at.
And Your Honor, I'm going to, okay. Does this pose, I think, to be consistent with what you just told me, does this pose a dangerous threat to a contact officer if the subject is with 2 knives at this distance, holding them out like this?
Extremely.
Okay. Now, a cover officer is to, as I think you just said, is to watch these hands, correct?
That is correct.
And watch the person, the body, and what he's doing, is that correct?
That's correct.
And the cover officer is supposed to react, correct?
He is.
Do you train your officers in SWAT that if someone is like this and makes an aggressive step towards a contact officer, that the cover officer is supposed to shoot him?
Objection, Your Honor, hypothetical, and I think it is an
Well-
again, getting into.
I'm going to allow the question. I think it was basically covered on the direct and accurate or not. I think it's a proper question to be asked. Go ahead.
Do you teach, is the Albuquerque police officers taught that when they are a cover officer and this threat is posed, that they are supposed to shoot this person?
If you're advancing, yes.
Okay. And in advancing, now let's talk about the distance that you're taught. With edged weapon knives, or with edged weapons, specifically knives, distance is a very big factor, isn't it?
It is, sir.
And the Albuquerque Police Department and you teach that to your officers, correct?
That's correct.
And the reason that's a big issue is because they're a deadly weapon and people, officers have been known to get killed by knives, right?
Absolutely.
And people can close distance with a knife before you can actually respond with your own lethal force as an officer, correct?
That is correct.
And so in that particular situation, a cover officer is the person that is supposed to respond to that lethal force, isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And distance, as we just talked about, is significant, and elevation difference can be significant. Is that right?
Absolutely.
You did talk on direct a little bit about elevation and the concerns that are posed to you and the footing and issues like this, but was also a concern the fact that if he was significantly higher, would you agree from what you observed he was significantly higher from Officer Weimerskirtz?
I'll object that the question's compound, Judge. If he's just asking the last part, I don't have an objection to the last part.
I think he's just asking the last part.
Would you
Go ahead.
Would you agree that from what you saw, Mr. Boyd was significantly higher in elevation than Officer Weimerskirtz?
Yes.
And would you also agree that when you're in higher elevation, you are trained and you train people to understand that they can close distance even faster, isn't that correct?
That is correct.
Are you also trained that edged knives is a deadly threat? And do you also train people in close proximity like this from someone should be considered the same type of deadly threat as if the person had a gun, correct?
Yes, sir.
And would you agree with me, and the last question along these lines, would you agree with me that if an officer who is a cover officer perceives a deadly threat on the officer that he is covering, that it is not only he's trained that way, but he is trained that it is obligation and duty to shoot that person?
Objection compound.
I'll allow the question.
Are they trained that it's their obligation to shoot that person?
Yeah, if need be, deploy deadly force.
And are they also trained that it is their duty to shoot that person?
Yes.
You mentioned earlier that less lethal often fails.
That's correct.
And can you explain a little bit about that? What do you mean that it fails?
Depending on the subject, mental status, if he is on any kind of substances, just the technology in itself, one less lethal a lot of times won't take care of all of the different threats that could be out there that we face. There are some individuals who go right down for a beanbag. There are other individuals from my training experience that can fight through 30 beanbag rounds. Fighting through 30 beanbag rounds is a failure. So it is good to have other forms of less lethal to overwhelm that subject.
Have you experienced an incident where, for example, what's known as a flashbang device fails?
Yes.
And when that fails, what do we mean by that?
Flashbang failures can be failure to ignite, which means it won't go off. There are some people who are not affected by a noise flash diversionary device. In my experience, most people, when deploying a flashbang or noise flash diversionary device, a lot of times will go to the ground, they'll be stunned. There are some individuals who are just, their brain is disconnected, whatever it may be, and they're able to shrug that off and not be affected by it.
Okay. And taser shotguns, what would be an example of the way a taser shotgun would fail?
If the taser didn't incapacitate the individual.
So in other words, no response from the individual. it's shot, but nothing, the individual doesn't alter his behavior in any way.
Correct, sir.
Okay. And then a dog. A dog, is that a form of canine dog? A police dog, is that a form of a less lethal option?
It is,
And have you seen that fail before?
absolutely.
And that would mean that the dog wasn't able to do what?
Incapacitate the individual, distract him until we were able to place him into custody safely.
Okay. And you mentioned earlier, I touched on it, but you mentioned earlier, Direct, that the hands are so important.
Yes, sir.
To stay focused on.
Yes, sir.
And why is that?
Again, it is the hands that will kill or injure you.
And is it even a heightened concern when you know the person has knives in their pocket, for example?
Yes, it is.
And are you trained to understand whether or not at times the mentally ill can pose more of a threat to police officers?
Yes.
And why is that?
A lot of times they are not taking their medication. They're not in a good state of mind.
They're not predictable, is that right?
That's correct.
Now, are officers also trained in SWAT, as you talked about your training? They trained about the time that it takes officers to react to an action.
Yes, the term is reactionary gap.
And what does that mean to you?
Objection, Your Honor, beyond the scope of direct.
Sustained.
Just a moment, Your Honor.
Yes.
Just to be clear, you said earlier you used the word if he's advancing. As far as a subject with two knives, perhaps 8 feet away, and held him out, you said if he's advancing, he may pose a deadly threat.
Advancing or making any type of furtive movement, aggressive movement. Aggressive movement could be interpreted that way, absolutely.
Pass the witness, Your Honor.
Before we continue with the cross, Ms. McGinn, I'm going to take a recess, about 15 minutes, and before we do that, I just need to ask Sergeant one question before I forget it. You've talked about layers of force, non-deadly force to use. Are officers taught that they can repeat or try a failed non-deadly use of force again if it doesn't succeed?
If they're able to get that tool up and running again or reload that tool, yes.
As an example, if in a situation where an officer fires a beanbag shot and it misses or it fails to incapacitate the person, are they allowed or are they trained that they could do that again or repeat that?
That's correct, sir.
Okay. Let's take about a 15-minute recess, and then we'll start with Ms. McGinn's questioning. And one other thing, counsel, that I neglected to do, and it's my fault, but because we have a different court reporter, I neglected to have you all enter your appearances on the record, so when we come back, I'll ask you to do that, okay? Be the first thing. We'll be in recess.
All rise.